Hey guys, this is Dave with AudioIn, and I've got three IEMs that kind of span the lower end of the budget spectrum. I've got the Trn Medusa, which is the least expensive of the three, coming in at $52. Then I've got the CCA Hydro, which is priced at $113, and then finally the Bqeyz Cloud, which comes in at $169. Now my hope is to try and keep this video between 10 and 13 minutes, which means I'm going to have to talk fast and do more of a mini review of each set, but I will do my best to cover all the main points with each set. We have a lot to talk about, so let's get started. So again, in order to save time, I'm not going to talk about the design or go over the accessories. However, I probably will have some B-roll of all that going on in the background while I talk about the sound. But let's go ahead and start with the Hydro. So I think this may be the most expensive CCA set to date. And again, it comes in at $113. And while I haven't owned or heard all of CCA's releases, I am pretty familiar with a lot of them. And I can definitely say this is without a doubt the best CCA set I've ever heard, and I would probably even go as far as saying this is one of my favorite one of them at least, favorite V/U-shaped sets. And it's kind of interesting because I was just talking about budget V-shaped sets in my Dynabird and also my more recent Titan S2 reviews. And up until that point, my favorite V-shaped budget set was the EA500, but I have to say, this set does seem to get a lot right, and I think this may also give the EA500 a run for its money. Maybe not as good as the Titan S2, but very close. Now, of course, this does have the 5 official tuning options depending on the switch configuration, and I did try all of them, and the switch configuration I settled on was switches 1 and 2 in the up position and then 3 and 4 in the down position, because it just seemed to sound the most balanced to me. And then the other options were just a little too upper mid forward for me. And again, this came across as a V-shaped signature to my ears. But just to summarize my thoughts on why I think this is a great V-shaped set for this price point. First, despite what it looks like on paper, the bass, while definitely leaning towards the fun side, doesn't actually overpower or dominate the presentation. There's just enough to balance out the upper mids and treble. It also has great dynamics, and while it does have a little bit of bass bleed, it did still have some texture in the mid bass, not a lot, but some, and it still does a pretty decent job of retaining mid-range detail. And I say pretty decent because it's still only about as good as what you might expect for this price point. And while I do find the mid-range to sound maybe a little thin in its presentation, it's not so much as to become distracting, and I do still feel like it has enough body to keep it from sounding too light or overly thinned. And then as you move into the upper mids, that energy picks up substantially, which means vocals are going to sound quite forward. And I would also point out, as good as this set is, it does still suffer from some of the typical issues commonly associated with a V-shaped signature, one of them being a naturalness in the mid-range. Then as you move into the treble, that energy carries straight through. So you have a very energetic and engaging treble presentation. But what's nice is that treble energy brings with it nice amounts of detail, air, and shimmer. And if I were to maybe summarize the presentation of this set on the whole, I would say it's engaging and fun, but it does still maintain a decent sense of naturalness. And again, it does still have some issues with unnaturalness, especially when compared with some of the other sets in this price range like the Del C or Explorer. But for this having a V-shaped signature, I actually think it's probably one of the more natural V-shaped sets I've heard, edging it pretty close to the Titan S2, but still falling maybe slightly behind. So this is not my favorite set at the $100 price point. The Del C and Explorer are still two of my favorites. Again, they are just both more natural sounding to me, but I would say I do get as much listening enjoyment from the Hydro as I do the EA500. Again, I genuinely feel like this is one of the best CCA sets I've ever heard. So I definitely feel like CCA is heading in the right direction, and I think a lot of hobbyists that are looking for a fun or engaging set would be very happy with the Hydro. Although personally, again, if I'm looking for a V-shaped set at this price point, I would probably be more likely to lean towards the Titan S2 over the Hydro. Okay, now let's go ahead and jump way down in price and let's talk about the Trn Medusa. So this set is priced at $52. This is another V-shaped tuned IEM, but if I'm being honest, I did not really find myself connecting with this set like I did with a Hydro, mainly because its signature was just a little too bright for me. And I did find that it could get a little shouty in the upper mids at times, but let's go ahead and break things down a little further, then we'll talk about my general impressions of the Medusa. So the first thing I noticed about this set was that it engaged me, and it did have a pretty fun presentation, which is usually something you kind of hope to get from a decent V-shaped tuned set. And the bass, while maybe lacking a little energy, at least when contrasted against the upper mids and treble, still did have pretty decent impact and thump. However, it did also sound a little bloaty and uncontrolled, and I did notice some bass bleed in the mid-range as well. Now, the mid-range is also pretty recessed, as it is very common with many V-shaped tuned sets, and because of that, it does also introduce some unnaturalness. However, it wasn't necessarily overly recessed, and the overall mid-range quality was basically about on par with most of the other V-shaped sets in this price range. But then as you move into the upper mids, that energy picks up quite a bit, as does the treble and upper treble, and that's where I started to pick up on some of the things that didn't really align with my preference. And what I'm referring to is, again, the general presentation of the Medusa leans bright to me. So some notes can sometimes come across as overly sharp and even sibilant. However, at the same time, that can give some tracks a sense of clarity and resolution, and it also does contribute to, again, a more engaging listening experience. My issue was that depending on the track I was listening to, sometimes I found myself reaching for the volume knob to turn it down. And unfortunately, in the end, while again, I did find the set to be engaging, I also found myself experiencing listening fatigue after a while, and it made it hard for me to make any significant connection with the Medusa. And I'm sure there will be those who do make that connection, but for me personally, within this $50 price range, I'm more drawn to sets like the Oranos or Cadenza. Okay, and then moving on to our next and final IEM, the Bqeyz Cloud. This set is priced at $169. Now, the last Bqeyz set I reviewed was the Winter, and I think it was probably about 6 months ago or so, and I still have that set. And I did pull it out just to kind of give myself a little bit of a refresher and also compare it with the Cloud. And you know what? I actually preferred the presentation of the Wind over the Cloud. And then I pulled out the Winter Ultra, and I also preferred its tuning over the Cloud as well. And it's a little interesting because I just talked about the Trn Medusa's tuning being bright and more upper mid focused, and how it strays somewhat away from my tuning preference. And coincidentally, to a degree, all three of those Bqeyz releases have similar tuning characteristics as far as them having a more mid-centric presentation. And of the three, the Cloud is the most mid-forward. And in my opinion, it suffers from some of the same issues that we just spoke about with Medusa in regards to it maybe being a little too mid-forward and sounding maybe a little unnatural. And unfortunately, I did notice the Cloud starting to veer a little bit into shouty territory. And I found myself having to turn the volume down just a little bit on certain tracks. And then when I would get the upper mids to a good volume level, then the bass energy would drop below my preference. And I know I'm kind of working my way backwards, but speaking of bass, I did find the bass to be quite good in terms of dynamics, extension, and just its overall quality. I just wish there was more of it to help kind of balance out the upper mids and treble. And now I'm going to jump to treble, so I'm all over the place here, but the treble energy was also a little bit north of my preference, and then combined with that upper mid-range, again, it just made for a pretty bright presentation. And the Cloud's balance was tilted just a little too much towards the top half of the tuning for my preference. So unfortunately for me, personally, I just didn't find myself making a strong connection with the Cloud. And look, I feel like I need to acknowledge that this hobby is, and we all know, it's very subjective, and there are going to be those of you whose tuning preference may not align with mine, and that's why it's important to try and find a reviewer that shares your tuning preference and maybe even your music genre preference. And just to clarify, my tuning preference is neutral with a little bit of a bass boost, and while I do prioritize naturalness over technical performance is still very important to me. But again, when I'm choosing an IEM, I usually have a proclivity to reach for something that can naturally reproduce vocals and instruments over producing detail, depth, layering, imaging, or just anything related to technical performance. Bottom line though, again, for me personally, I just didn't really find myself connecting with the Cloud very much. But of the three sets, I did like the Hydro quite a bit. So that concludes my review of the Hydro, Medusa, and Cloud. Thank you guys so much for taking the time to watch. If you like my content, please take a second and hit that subscribe button. Also, if you would please like this video, please share this video. I hope you guys have an awesome day.